Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the third lecture of the New Asian Lectures of Confucianism 2025, sponsored by the Moonchu Foundation, organized by New Asia College at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Today's speaker is Professor Paul Goldin, currently the Professor and Chair at the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilization, University of Pennsylvania. His lecture topic is How I Teach Confucianism to Americans, and it will be delivered in English. After the lecture, you are invited to scan the QR code on the back of the lecture booklet to fill out an online feedback form and share your thoughts on today's event. The lecture will begin shortly. Let us now hand over the time to the moderator, Professor Ji Hua Yao, in the Department of Philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Please welcome Professor Yao.
Good afternoon, friends. Yeah, you're welcome, very welcome to join this lecture. So let me take a few minutes to introduce Professor Paul Goldin. He is the professor chair at the Department of East Asian Language and Civilization at University of Virginia, and he right now the co-editor of Kumbao, which is oldest continuously published sinologist journal in the and he is the author of 6 books. Most recent one is the one published last year, The Worlds of Classical Chinese Aesthetics. And also he added 7 books. He has also published over 60 articles in academic journals and collaborative volumes. Yeah, besides this academic activity, he is also a member of the 7th Council of the International Confucian Association. So today his topic is how I teach Confucianism to Americans. Please for me to help me.
Or do I need to Thank you for coming. Thank you for choosing to listen to a lecture on how I teach Confucianism to Americans instead of listening to the drum performance. I think I would have chosen the drums. When I looked at the list of previous speakers in the series, this is the 11th annual New Asia Lectures in Confucianism. And when I looked at the previous 10, I noticed that I was the only non-Chinese speaker who's ever been invited. So that made me think it might be interesting to choose a topic, how I teach Confucianism to Americans. And the proof that this is really going to be how I teach Confucianism to Americans is that I gave the exact same lecture at the University of Minnesota 2 weeks ago. What I'm going to do is talk through some core texts from the Confucian classics in English, because when I teach to Americans, I don't presume that they can speak Chinese. The graduate level, we go through it in Chinese. For undergraduates, you can't speak that. And another choice that I've made is, at least at first, to use very widely accepted published translations just to convince you that I am not giving you skewed interpretations. I'm not loading the dice by translating the texts in an unusual or disingenuous way, although you'll find that about halfway through I give up and I just start my own translation if I can't deal with the published ones anymore. You start off with some very famous published translation. And before long, I think you'll see how this material grabs American students very quickly. So the first one, if this were a class, I would ask someone to read it, but it's not a class. And the reason why the romanization is all in Wade Giles is that I'm choosing somebody else's published translations. First name, of course, is T. Kangzi. T. Kangzi asked Confucius about government. Confucius replied, to govern is to rectify. If you lead the people by being rectified yourself, who will there not? Analects 1217, translated by Winston. So what does all that mean? Analects 1217. Analects is the name borrowed from Greek that the Jesuits used when they were busy translating Lunyu into Western languages. Lunyu means selected sayings, and analects in Greek, analekta, means selected sayings. So it's not a bad translation. It's not misleading. You can call the text Lunyu, you can call the text selected sayings, you can call the text analects. There's really no methodological reason why any of those are wrong. And translated by Wing Tzu Chan. Chan was one of the premier translators of Chinese philosophical texts into English in the 20th century. It's about as mainstream a translation. What is this text, the Analects, 1217? Well, Confucius himself did not write down his teachings. There are some people who say Confucius never wrote anything. There are some people who say Confucius couldn't read and write. Okay, I'm not going that far, I think, Confucius. In fact, I find it highly unlikely, for reasons that I'm about to explain, highly unlikely that Confucius could read and write. But it is absolutely true that he didn't. He was what we might call a ritual master, and we know from other sources that there were such people. What's a ritual master? Well, if you go to a museum today and you look at the exhibit of artifacts from the Chinese Bronze Age, you will find lots of ritual bronze vessels, different shapes, different sizes, different purposes. And they were used in lineage sacrifices that involved communication with ancestral spirits. It was very important when you were carrying out such ceremonies not to do it wrong. First of all, most obviously, you could burn yourself. But then also on a spiritual level, if there's any problem with the communication with your ancestors, that's bad. So what many lineages would do is hire a lineage master to teach the young, who would eventually go on to supervise these ceremonies, how you use this vessel, how you use that vessel. And it seems pretty clear that before very long, ritual masters started including moral lessons. It wasn't just about how you use this vessel. There were also some moral principles to consider. The problem is we don't know too much about what they taught because their writings haven't survived. There will be some brief and obscure references to people whose names we know. There'll be some sort of ritual or political problem at court, and they'll say, let's ask someone what he thinks. Give wise advice, and then we never hear from him again. Confucius is the first ritual master for whom we have any significant body teaching. The reason for that seems to be that his disciples, and probably disciples of disciples, felt that his teachings needed to be remembered now. Their recollections may have differed. Their points of emphasis certainly different. And we know very little about the principles of redaction. The received text is in 20 chapters. The last 5 smell a little different from the first 15. Most people focus on the first 15. But the principles of organization are quite opaque to us. as well as the principles of inclusion and exclusion. For that matter, very often they are presented without any context. We don't know under what circumstances Qigong is. Was it at dinner? Was it at a formal occasion? Confucius himself does not seem to have had much political background, murky, maybe sort of from the lowest level of the nobility, but not. And so when we read an opening line, Qigong asked Confucius about government, I'm not saying that didn't happen, but it's a sign that the disciples want us to believe that very important people were asking Confucius for his advice. Who is Qigong? He's not the ruler, but he's a member of one of the three ministerial families, the Jiswen family, and he is deeply involved in the administration. Qigong asked Confucius is a little bit like Secretary of State Rubio asked Goldin about foreign policy. If you read that, you would think to yourself, so it's clear that, we'll see another example of this in a moment. It's clear that the disciples want us to believe that although Confucius himself had scant real authority, people who did came to him for advice. Another point, when you're reading the Analects, because the material is pared to the bone and you're usually not given much context, you have to develop a kind of a nose for cues. And when Qigong asks Confucius about government, you have to suspect that Qigong maybe doesn't know what he's doing. Why would Secretary of State Rubio ask me about foreign policy? He's the foreign policy expert. Now that suspicion is not always going to work. As you're reading, you have to have these suspicions in mind and keep reading to see whether they're confirmed. In this case, it will be, but in another example that we'll see later, it won't be. So it's not a clear, unambiguous sign. But it's an interpretation that you have to be entertaining in your mind. That Qigong is asking Confucius about government because he doesn't know. Confucius replied to governance to rectify, and I supplied the two Chinese graphs. Chan does not, in order to show you that to govern and to rectify in Old Chinese are the same word. Zheng means to rectify, to set right. And the one on the left is the word that we still use today for government. And that little graphic component on the right side is added to indicate that the special meaning of rectification as government is intended. If you leave it out, it could mean government, but that's not the first interpretation. First interpretation is rectification, setting something straight, something setting. So Confucius responds with a definition, which seems to confirm our notion that Confucius thinks Qigong doesn't know what he's doing. He's supposed to be in charge of government, and he doesn't even know the definition of government. To govern is to rectify. Now, what does that mean? We'll see in a moment that this is a moral definition, an uncompromising. And for Americans in particular, it immediately contrasts, just on the level of metaphor, with the words that we use for government all the time. What is the source of the word government? It comes from the Latin word gubernator. And if this were a real class, I would ask whether anyone has taken Latin. Do you know what a gubernator is? And usually the answer is no, because not many Americans take Latin anymore. A governor is somebody who steers a ship. The metaphor is the ship of state. And the person who is steering our ship of state, that is out. It's a very different metaphor from the one that Confucius is advancing in this passage. Government is a matter of rectification for Confucius and his disciples. The word we use for governing, governmental, gubernatorial, whenever they have the elections, the anchormen and anchorwomen on the evening news, they always want to show off that they know the word gubernatorial. So they always say things like, in addition to today's tonight's presidential election, the name is gubernatorial. You can't wait to use the word gubernatorial. Of course, if you ask them, do you know where this word gubernatorial comes from? Somebody who's foolish. If you lead the people by being rectified yourself, who will dare not be? This confirms our suspicions that he has made a hash of his job as administrator. The people are not rectified. That's why he has to ask Confucius about government. Confucius' answer is, why are the people not rectified? It's because you're not rectified. If you rectified yourself, they would follow suit. They're not rectified. It follows, you must not. If you just read one of a passage from the Analects, decontextualized manner like this, you can never be certain of the intent. This seems to make sense, but you always have to read it against other passages, the Analects, to see whether it's confirmed or problematized by other passages. So I chose another one, 13:6, which I think will confirm some of the suspicions and some of the initial interpretations that we formulated after 1217. Confucius said, if a ruler sets himself right, he will be followed without his command. If he does not set himself right, even his commands will not. Analects 13:6 is from the next chapter of the Analects, once again translated by Chi. This echoes many of the ideas that we saw in the first passage. If a ruler sets himself right, he will be followed without his command. If he does not set himself right, even his commands will not be obeyed. In everyday English, we have the expression, actions speak louder than words, which is grammatically incorrect. Actions speak more loudly than words. It was like easier said than done. No, more easily said than done. Anyway, we're not getting into the intricacies of the misuse of adverbs in 21st century English. But yes, we have the saying, actions speak louder than words. This is even stronger than that. The words are meaningless. People don't pay attention to the words, they watch them. I don't know if you know of the American comic Peanuts, Charlie Brown. Have you ever watched it? And you know, when any adult speaks, it's always wah, 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 wah. The only people who speak are the children. And whenever the adults are talking, it's brilliant. So it's always sort of in the distance, and it's always wah, 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 wah. That's what's going on here. The people don't really listen to what the ruler says. It's just something like that. What they do is watch what the ruler does. The ruler sets an example that they're going to follow. If the ruler sets a rectified example, they'll follow suit. If the ruler doesn't, they'll follow suit. As I said, this harmonizes with the implicit but very harsh critique of Qi in the previous passage. Qi must be an incompetent governor. He doesn't understand the very definition of government. And his people are not rectified. It must be because he's not. Now we have to ask, why do Confucians attribute so much influence to the ruler? If you lead the people by being rectified yourself, who will dare not be rectified? A ruler sets himself right. Well, what explains the Confucian confidence in the influence of the ruler, or in the case of Xikanzi, the ruler's close associates? The answer is that Confucians believe that we all influence each other. But most people don't have the capacity to influence more than their family, friends, maybe neighbors. For most of us, if we make a mistake, it could affect our family, could affect our friends. Less likely, but it could affect our neighbors. It's not going to affect the whole country. If I misuse an adverb, it's not as though, all of the United States, not a good example, because they're already misusing. But if I make some kind of horrible decision, it's not as though people in Idaho are going to be affected. The ruler has a special platform. The ruler affects everyone by virtue of his actions. And it's not because he's superhuman or there's anything special about him as a human being. It's because of his social position. Everybody knows what the ruler does. Even if they never see him, they know what the ruler does because all of his decisions impact them. He's the only person who has that authority. So people pay special attention to the behavior of the ruler. Who affects you? Your family affects you, your friends affect you, your neighbors might affect you. And the ruler affects you. Beyond that, not many. So what Confucius is saying when he criticizes Xikanzi and other thoughtless rulers, when they don't understand the very definition of government, it's inevitable that they're going to preside over kings. In order to be an effective ruler, you have to understand that that begins with the moral rectification of oneself, which will contribute to the moral rectification of the entire population, because the people will see the image of the virtuous and be inspired to follow suit. Or if he's a bad ruler, people will see the image of the thoughtless, corrupt, cruel, selfish ruler, and likewise be inclined to follow. Moving on, Confucius said, lead the people with governmental measures and regulate them by law and punishment, and they will avoid wrongdoing but have no sense of honor. Lead them with virtue and regulate them with virtue. They'll have a sense of shame and, moreover, set themselves. Here's Analects 2:3 translated Chan again, slightly modified. And here's the first moment where I have a quibble with the translation. I don't like shame. The Chinese word means same, shame, sure. But in this context and in similar contexts, I think our word conscience is closer to what's meant. An internal moral sense. What's wrong with governmental measures, legal regulations? This can come as a shock to American students because we like to say we are a nation of law. Sometimes I wonder whether but we like to tell ourselves that we are a nation of law, or a nation of. And here is Confucius saying that's inadequate. We need to do better than regulating law and punishment. And what's the objection? Why is regulating people with laws and punishments inadequate? The example that I give for students is that of a traffic light. People stop at a red light and they go at a green. Why do they stop at a red light? Well, you can think of two reasons. First, they might not want to go into oncoming traffic because they might not want to cause an accident. Or they might not want to get a ticket. There might be a police officer, there might be a camera. And both of those are real, but which one is more important? Clearly the second one. And the proof is that you can be at an intersection at 3 o'clock in the morning where there's no oncoming traffic and people still stop at a red light. Even though it's hardly plausible that they're going to get into an accident by going through the red light. Why? Because during the camera or the police officer. And what's wrong with that? It's very effective. People stop at red lights. They stop at red lights even at 3 o'clock in the morning. What's wrong with that is that it doesn't improve them morally. You can still be a thoroughly wicked person and stop reliably at every red light. A movie villain who's nothing but evil could still stop at a red light. Doesn't improve them morally, doesn't contribute to the development of their conscience. And what's so good about this conscience? It causes people to set themselves right, causes people to improve their own conduct without having to be observed, caught, and then punished. Because that approach is like whack-a-mole. Here somebody commits a crime, convict and punish. But then someone over here commits a crime, convict and punish. You're constantly reacting all over the country to the crimes that people are committing. Wouldn't it be better if we had some sort of device to encourage people not to break the law in the first place? Confucius thinks that's the kind of outcome that you get when you encourage rectification. At every moment, people will think to themselves, what is my moral obligation? Is it all right for me to do such and such? This kind of moral reasoning is crucial to Confucius. And Confucius himself seems to think that it is inculcated by means of virtue and ritual. So whatever ritual means, it is not a code. Sometimes people misunderstand that. There's a lot of early interpreters of Confucianism for Western audiences simplistically describe ritual as a code. Handshake. Everybody knows what a handshake symbolizes. Well, it can't be a legal code because we've just seen that legal codes are inadequate. Don't improve people's character. They just shape people's conduct. It doesn't effectuate any kind of internal transformation. So ritual has to be something else. Whatever ritual is, it's a very interesting, complex subject. Discuss it. But whatever ritual is, it has to foster moral reasoning. It has to be something that prompts people to ask themselves, why are we doing this? What are the moral principles? How would I apply these principles to real life situations? Whatever ritual is, it has to be an institution that fosters that kind of reflection. And laws don't. On to the next one. Now, this is attributed to a later follower of Confucianism called Mencius. Amongst all these Latin names, Confucius, Mencius, we have the Jesuits to thank for them too. Mencius is monk. Confucius is Kongzi, or they thought they were translating Confucius. Confucius is pretty rare in language, but they don't say Confucius, they say Confucius. Xunzi didn't get not Zunzius, it's just Xunzi, because the Jesuits were informed by Chinese literati who didn't reckon Xunzi as one of the great Confucians like Confucius. Now, it's sometimes said that Mencius was a disciple of Confucius' grandson. That's hardly likely. You would have to imagine a scenario in which Confucius' grandson is on his deathbed and the infant Mencius is his student, because the distance in time is nearly 3 centuries. You see Confucius's nearly 2 centuries. Excuse me. You see Confucius's traditional The birth and death years, 551 to 479. If that's wrong, it's not wrong by much. There really was a person by Confucius named Confucius, and he really lived sometime around 550. Maybe it's a year off, it's a couple months off, or maybe it's exactly right. That's close to Confucius. For Mencius, we have 371 and 289. Likewise, awfully close to the truth, and that's in the early 2nd century. So it's highly unlikely that he was a disciple of Confucius's grandson. What's more plausible is that he was Confucian in the mold of Confucius's grandson. What do I mean by that? While Confucius was still alive, there weren't many disputes and controversies over the interpretation of his philosophy, because if you were confused or you felt that one of his sayings was ambiguous, you could ask him, Master, what did you mean when you said such and such? And there are even passages in Analyze where this happens. The disciples will say, previously you said such and such. And in Neo-Confucian discourse, this is very common. Previously you said such and such, but then how do you resolve this? And while the master is still alive, you have an authoritative resolution. Once the master is dead, there's no authoritative resolution anymore. You have different Confucians who are equally sincere, but they have incompatible or distinct interpretation. It's very saying. So what's plausible is that Mencius belonged to the kind of Confucian teaching represented by France. Anyway, Mencius went to see King Hui of the Sir, said the king, you have come all this distance, thinking nothing of 1,000 miles. You must surely have some way of profiting. Majesty, answered Mencius, what is the point of mentioning the word profit? All that matters is that there should be benevolence and righteousness. If your majesty says, how can I profit my state? And the gentlemen and commoners say, how can I profit my person? Then those above and those below will be trying to profit at the expense of one another, and the state will be imperiled. What's going on? Well, this one, Mencius 1A1, it's very opening of the book of Mencius, and this one is translated by D.C. Lau, well known to anyone. What's going on? Well, the word translated as sir in Chinese is actually old man. And in the sense of venerable. And King Hui of Liang was older than Mencius. So King Hui of Liang is telling this younger philosopher, venerable old man, you have come all this distance thinking nothing of 1,000 miles. You must surely have some way of profit. It's probably just a formulaic courtesy, meaning not much more than welcome. In fact, the king probably has a whole waiting room of silly philosophers who are led into his throne room one by one. And each time the king says, sir, you have come all this distance thinking nothing of 1,000 miles. You must surely have some way of profiting in the state. It means nothing more than be welcome. I will not chop off your head or crush your kneecaps. What do you have to tell me? But Mencius is so fanatical about the idea of government as recognition that he cannot tolerate even this formulaic premise. Why mention the word profit? And the king is thinking to himself, I'm just trying to be polite. But Mencius won't tolerate it. Why profit? And he goes on to say two very interesting things. First, he uses the phrase benevolence and righteousness. It's not exactly the same phrase that Confucius had used up here. Now, certainly benevolence and righteousness, certainly in the Analects, Confucius used those terms. It's not as though Mencius was inventing something said. So he is following suit and accepting the conclusion that a ruler has to be concerned with inculcating morality. And any other purpose of government is illegitimate and reflects a fundamental misunderstanding. For Americans, this is also somewhat shocking. Whenever it's campaign season, we have political advertising in the United States. What do they talk about? Lately, there's been some talk about cultural issues, but for the most part, they talk about taxation, they talk about inflation, they talk about the health of the economy. Sometimes they talk about health insurance, but that's an economic problem. That is not a medical problem. Mostly, the issues that people discuss when they advertise themselves for public office, mostly they're economic. And you can imagine how Mencius would have responded. For American students, the Confucian alternative is somewhat troubling. Can you imagine an American candidate who said, vote for me because we'll have rectification? Now, I have to say, in 2025, that's a little bit less unimaginable than it used to be. In 1995, that was. Imagine Bill Clinton, vote for me because we'll have moral rectification. The second interesting thing that Mencius does is that although he accepts the Confucian idea that government is a moral enterprise and that rulers who don't understand this are not qualified to rule, here he presents an argument that you don't find in the Analects itself. It's an argument out of prudence. Why should the ruler emphasize benevolence and righteousness and not profit? Because once again, the people will follow suit. They will understand very well which priorities the ruler is pursuing. And if profit is your priority, then you would be willing, if necessary, to profit at the expense of someone else. And who has the most to lose in an environment in which people permit themselves to profit at the expense of someone else? The one who has the most to lose is the ruler. If I'm going to break into somebody's house and steal all of the furniture, it's not going to be some ordinary person's house. I'm going to break into the royal palace. This is not to say that Mencius didn't accept the other Confucians for understanding government as a class. But this is a slightly different spin on an older idea. It's in your best interest, Your Majesty, to emphasize benevolence and righteousness, because a populace that is inspired by this example and behaves benevolently and righteously is unlikely to assassinate you, unlikely to depose you. You will be able to rule over that kind of population, service or calm, and constantly have to watch who's about to try to assassinate, who's about to try to take advantage. Back to the Analects. Duke Jing of Qi asked Confucius about government. Now here is a case where that suspicion is not going to be confirmed. I think Duke Jing of Qi is asking Confucius about government. Who's Duke Jing of Qi? He's a little bit like President Macron of France. You know, Qi is important, but it's not the United States. It's not China. It's France. So this would be a little bit like President Macron asked Goldin about retirement funding to France. Confucius replied, let the ruler be the ruler, the minister, the father, and the son. And then I cut out the second half where Duke Jing of Qi basically says, what a great answer. And he repeats it. And he said, if I don't do this, then even if I have to. So if you if you begin this one with the same suspicion that she doesn't know what he's doing, doesn't know what he's talking about, here your suspicion will be foiled. It turns out that she is sincerely asking, did this really happen? I wasn't there. I'm not going to say that it didn't happen. And by and large, I don't think the disciples were liars. But I have some doubts. It's not much likelier than the pretense that President Macron has to think about how he should deal with funding retirement in France. It seems a little bit. And you'll also notice that here's Analects 1211, and I don't credit any other translator because I can't accept the way anybody else deals with let the ruler be the ruler, the minister, the father, the son. In Chinese, that is Jin Tan Tan Fu Fu Zi, or in Mandarin. In classical Chinese, you can do that. You can have noun, verb, noun, verb. And most other translations will say something like, let the ruler act as befits the ruler, which is not wrong, but it's extremely clumsy. And in Confucianism, there is the conviction that a well-articulated statement is more effective than a clumsy one. In other words, it's not just what you say, it's how well you say it. If you say it in a particularly effective way, it'll go further. More people will hear it, more people will be impressed. Brilliant formulation. And in our translation, we have to try to capture it. So that's why I say, let the ruler be the ruler, the minister, the father, the son. You can't just say ruler, minister, father, son, because that's gibberish in English. So you can't be quite as economical as Confucius, but you have to try. What does this mean? I would say many Americans would have the intuitive interpretation that this means something like we mean when we say stay in your lane. Don't get involved in something that's not your job. Leave ruling to the ruler. The ruler is, you're not. Don't leave the ministerial duties to the ministers. Your own. There are some ministers, but not. This is not how the passage was understood by any tradition. Never understood it. Rather, the mainstream Confucian interpretation was that if you are going to call yourself a ruler, you need to live up to moral requirements that come with it. And as we saw right at the beginning, rulers don't always understand this. And they can't possibly live up to the moral requirements that come with being a ruler if they don't even understand the moral requirements that come with it. So Jinjin, what does that mean? It means understanding that government is right. It means understanding that you, by virtue of the platform that you have inordinate influence over the behavior of people. And it means that your task is to use this special position for the purpose of trying to get people to better themselves, not for the purpose of enriching yourself, not even for the purpose of improving their lives materially. It's for the purpose of improving them morally. And if you don't do that, we don't really consider you a ruler. You're some sort of imposter. You're a fraud. Jinjin means you're the ruler. You have a lot of work to do. It's not fun. You might think it's about building palaces and having dance parties, banquets. The minister, what is that? Traditional interpretation is that means you need to help the ruler be a ruler. And that can be difficult. It does not mean simply obeying the ruler, cravenly carrying out the ruler's orders, allowing the ruler to give into his worst impulses. It means helping the ruler loyally by standing up to him when you perceive that he's about to do something wrong. He has a bad policy in mind or character flaw. And that can be dangerous because rulers usually don't like to be criticized. So Chen means you have to be fearless and you have to stand on principle. Many ministers use the opportunity to enrich themselves, to build the networks of corruption, to find cushy jobs for their nephews. That's not being a Confucian minister. Being a Confucian minister means helping the ruler live up to the obligation and having the courage to remonstrate with him, to expostulate with him, even at personal risk. It's not so easy to do. Could end up being punished. Let the father be the father. What does that mean? It means that if you are a father, then you have the welfare of your children to consider. It means you have to ask yourself, how do I help them commence the journey of moral reasoning that every Confucian needs to follow? How do I educate? How do I put them in situations that are conducive to their moral growth? And let the son be the son. That one is so difficult that there's a special word for it. It's called xiao, which we'll look at in a minute. That will be the last point in this lecture. But let the son be the son. Take a look at Analects 1:6. Being a son is tough. Young men should be filial when at home, respectful to their elders. When away from home, they should be earnest and faithful. They should love all extensively and be intimate with men of humanity. When they have any energy left over to spare after the performance of moral duties, they should use it to study literature and arts. It is exhausting just to read. Can you imagine living up to this? And Confucian's record, not easy to do. But in some respects, it's analogous to being a minister to a ruler. You have to help your parents live up to the moral obligations of their position. And that can be difficult. Just recognize this. What do you do when you see your parents committing a crime or cheating someone? You have to try to persuade them. There's an instance in the Analects where somebody's father steals a sheep. What are you supposed to do? Come on, Dad. Don't you think you can do better than stealing sheep? Really, Dad? Stealing sheep? Why don't you give the sheep back and do something else with that? But it's hard because if the parents don't listen to you, what are you supposed to do? A couple of comments about Xunjun Chen Chen Fu before we move on to Xiao, and then I think for today. There are a couple of general characteristics about these four cardinal roles: ruler, minister, father, son. The first is that they're all relative. You cannot be a son without a father. You cannot be a father without a son. You cannot be a minister without a ruler. You cannot be a ruler without ministers. And the Chinese word Chen means more than just minister. It also means subject. So if you are a ruler, you have Chen. And then somebody might say, well, but the ruler has no ruler above them. And the would immediately answer, well, that's not true. So even the ruler has somebody. They're all relative. They all require some other person to make the dyad work. And you can play more than one role over the course of your life, or even at the same time in your life. For example, I am my son's father, but while my father was still alive, I was his son. So I was a father and a son at the same time. Not true anymore because my father has passed away, but for a while, I was a son and a father at the same time. Ruler and minister, same thing. Most ministers were pretty prominent. They had their own schools. So they were as good as rulers over the people, over their own dependents, but then they were ministers to the ruler. And the consequence of this is that there are no perfectly applicable general rules. How should I behave? Well, Confucian would say, what's your relationship to the other person? The answer is not going to be the same. The way you should behave towards your children is not the same way you should behave towards your parents. So I can't give you any general rules about how you're supposed to behave. You have to ask yourself on each occasion, what is my relationship to the people involved? And what moral obligations do these relationships entail? It's not easy. You have to keep thinking about this over and over and over again, and your solution to a moral problem that you encountered on Monday might not be valid on Tuesday because the characters involved might not be the same. So your moral obligations. Second observation I want to make about Jungian intentional physics is I'm mindful of the time. Not only are these four roles all relative, they're also all male. The rulers were all male. Chen, in practice, were all male. There were no female Chen. There's one famous exception. I believe it's King Wu, one of his ministers, is his mom. And to me, that's the exception that proves the rule, right? Or is it King Wen's effort? I think it's King Wu's minister is his mom, and that minister is King Ji's widow. But in any case, one of the sage kings has a mom. Otherwise, all the Chen. Fu is undoubtedly male. And sometimes people say, well, when Confucius says father, he means parent. And my response would be no, because you could say fumu and he is not. He says fu. If you wanted to say father and mother, you could say father. Zi could be a male or a female child. I think most people would have interpreted this in traditional times as sons. It could be children. But once you have fu, you're likely to interpret it as male child. So what are the consequences of the fact that all of these roles are male? I don't think there's any doubt that the society in which Confucius formulated his philosophy was a sexist one. All of the kings were male. In practice, all of the ministers were male. Fathers had rights. We know this from excavated legal sources that mothers did not. I don't think we can try to deny that Confucius's society, also Confucius' disciples were all. We have a traditional list of who they were, and even if that list is invalid, we have some names of disciples in which they're all. So on the one hand, I don't think there's any doubt that this society was sexist, but there is an open question that arises. Does this sexism invalidate Confucianism for us today? And I truly mean that it's an open question because I don't different answers that you can find in the literature. I'll tell you my view, which is that the sexism is incidental. In other words, it is not essential to Confucian philosophy. Why? Because if you think about what it means to be a good father, to engage in moral reasoning, and so on, it's all ungendered. Thinking about the welfare of your children, thinking about your obligations to the other person, that does not depend on your gender. Men can do that, women, people of any gender. So my own view is that the sexism is an artifact of its time. It does not in itself invalidate today. You could still find meaning today and make these moral considerations on gender. But I will also say that there are people who don't think this is a relic philosophical speech. Last thing I want to talk about is filial piety. So in the May 4th movement, when Chinese students and intellectuals were asking themselves, how had China fallen so far? They tried to find elements of traditional Chinese culture that they thought were to blame. Clearly, there had been a drop. In the first half of the 18th century, even French commentators marveled at China. You can read early European accounts of this. Honestly, early China. The literacy rate is so high. Prosperity is unbelievable. They think of China as a society that is superior to their own. And you know you're doing well when French people concede that your society is better than their own. But once we get to the second half of Qianlong, European attitudes towards China change dramatically. Backwards, irrational tones. Clearly there's a drop off, and sometime around 1750 is where this change occurred. What accounts? It was one of the questions of the May 4th. And we wrote a famous essay explaining filial piety, in which he wrote a line that I'm sure many of you have heard before. The effect of the idea of filial piety has been to turn China into a big factory for the manufacturing of subjects. By the way, he's right, because he didn't say that filial piety means manufacturing obedient subjects. He says the effect of the idea of filial piety has been to turn China into a big factory for the manufacturing subject. It has been perverted by opportunistic governments who have used it as a convenient way to try to engineer a docile population. I'm not criticizing Wu himself, but I do want to close with a section from the opening of Xiaojing, the Canon of Filial Piety, that shows that a lot of later and commonplace understandings of filial piety reflect fairly grave misconception, at any rate wouldn't have been accepted by early Confucians themselves. You often hear the idea of Confucianism, backward ideology, because it requires children to subordinate themselves for the sake of their parents. That's not what filial piety originated. So here we have filial piety. Xiao is the root of virtue and the origin of instruction. Jiao. By the way, that etymological explanation doesn't work. So you have to be very careful when you read Chinese texts. Sometimes there's an etymological explanation to govern zheng, is to rectify zheng, and it does work. And then sometimes you read filial piety. Xiao is the root of virtue and the origin of instruction. Jiao, in fact, etymologically, that does not work. The texts don't tell you which of these etymologies are accurate and which are not. You have to figure that out on your own. But anyway, sit back down and I will lecture to you. You received yourself, your body, your hair, your skin from your mother and father. Not daring to destroy or injure these gifts is the beginning. And this line is very frequently repeated. Some very fanatical Neo-Confucians took this to mean that they shouldn't bathe frequently because they might harm a hair on their skin. So for filial purposes, they bathed as rarely as possible. And you could smell those people. There was no doubt about who such people were. You smell like the kind of person who's so fanatically filial that you don't bathe regularly. My point is that when people tirelessly repeat this, they forget the last statement. This is the beginning of filial piety. This is like the elementary school understanding of filial piety. And too many people stop there. What comes next? Establishing yourself, practicing the way, displaying one's name unto later generations in order to manifest one's mother and father is the end of filial piety. The beginning of filial piety is serving one's parents. Congratulations. You're in 6th grade now. The middle is serving one's ruler. The end is establishing oneself. Said in the Greater Elegantiae, that's why do you not remember your ancestors' virtue? What does that mean? The best way to glorify your parents and your ancestors all the way back, including deceased ancestors, is to achieve success yourself. What do I mean by that? Well, he is tenured professor at Chinese University of Hong Kong. One published book, another one accepted, third one on the way. What do people say about him? They say his parents must have done something right. What a good reflection on his parents that he has been so successful. That's the end of filial piety. The beginning of filial piety is not taking a bath because you might hurt hair on your body. The grown-up version of filial piety is to become your own morally autonomous, thinking, caring, insightful person who will achieve so much admiration that people will start to ask, what did that person's parents do right to produce a child who was so successful? And I think you'll agree that that's not factual subjects, but rulers didn't always like that interpretation of filial piety because it meant dealing with people who had their own opinions. Rulers don't always like it. Who have their own. Thank you. I think I'll stop here and leave some time for discussion.
We will now begin the Q&A session. Everyone is welcome to ask questions. If you are attending in person, please raise your hand and our staff will bring a microphone to you. For online participants, please click the Q&A button on Zoom webinar and submit your questions in text. The moderator and speaker will read and respond to them in real time. Thank you.
Please, any questions, comments?
Thank you, Professor Goldin, for an amazing talk today. My question is twofold. The first is, I wonder, in the context of America, the teaching of maybe Wu or Confucius or Mencius, how does it bring value to modern day, like U.S. society? And the second one is a bit of a criticism against Wu or Confucius. Let me be the devil's advocate here. So there is an ideal world or ideal political system that Confucius raised. But throughout the history, we don't often see that being implemented in reality. Like take the yesterday or the day before yesterday's Han Dynasty. It has been criticized of the outside is rule, but indeed within it is the system or thinking of Han Beizi. And so it's ruled by law or Ba. It's not what exactly Confucius was advocating about. And regarding the first part of the question, to supplement a little bit, I guess there is a community value that Confucius teaching will be able to bring to modern day society or political discussions. Because like the examples of eminent minister and also king and father and son, we do not view each individual as individual in Chinese culture. Like we are always playing a role within the society. And that might help us to appreciate a lot more of communitarian values and that line of thought. So I wonder what's your take on this thought and the two questions. Well, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Those are very interesting questions. The title is How I Teach Confucianism to Americans. It's not how I teach Americans to become Confucian. And I'm very clear about this in my own classes. I'm not a salesman. I'm not trying to convert anyone. And it's fine with me if students don't like these ideas. All that matters to me is whether they understand these. And then they're free to decide on their own how much room in their own life they're going to make. But I want to make sure that they understand the ideas because they have been distorted by so many people, both in East Asia and West, that let them decide for themselves. Let's look at what Confucius really said, or the best approximation that we have of what Confucius really said, and decide for ourselves and tune out exploitation of Confucian teachings and see what they think. And it works very well for a few reasons. Number one, they don't need much background. If you were to teach Buddhism or Confucianism, especially some of the more complex versions of religious Taoism, you have to make sure they understand a lot of facts first. Here, what did I have to explain? I had to explain who Ji Hanzi was. That took about 20 seconds. Qi Jinggong, I had to explain who he was. That took even less time. Very little time was required before they could jump in and wrestle with the ideas of the problem. That appeals. Another thing is they observe very quickly that these are some of the same questions that they wrestle with every day, and that whatever philosophical or religious tradition they come from has provided them and their families some answers. And these are unlikely to be the same answers. There may be some points of overlap with Christianity, or some points of overlap with Aristotelian virtue ethics, but it's not just the same. And it's very good for them to know that there is another tradition as old as the Aristotelian one, older than the Christian one, that wrestles with a lot of the same questions and provides answers or ways to think about these questions that are unlike what they learned at home or what they learned in Sunday school or academic school. What have you. So they tend to respond very well. And question of how Confucian they want to be, let alone the question of how Confucian we want our society and government. I don't get into that. I leave that for them to decide on their own. For one thing, it wouldn't be Confucian of me to tell them how they should respond to these ideas. The Confucian way is to expose them to the ideas and then let them work out the consequences on their own.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I think the way which you have presented in terms of the similarities or the differences between the Chinese thinking and Western thinking is very powerful. Through the use of contrast and drawing the terms to contemporary world so that people can better understand. However, the trouble is that, for instance, when you explain what analect is originating from from Latin, or how the word government actually means in the English world, very few people today can get to the bottom and the origin of these terms. So they can hardly find out the differences or the similarities, and then there will be no resonance, or there can be very limited understanding intercultural. So my question is, how you would recommend the younger generations to be able to better grasp the very fundamental things in our daily lives and not to take all the given terms or the very often frequently used terms at their face value.
I agree with you that most ordinary people don't know the etymology of the word governor. And yet, I still think it's useful to highlight that metaphorical difference. Because regardless of what they think the word governor means and where it comes from, I'm talking about American students, they do not intuitively associate government with regulation. They encounter that idea for the first time in the United. And contrasting it with the way they're likely to think about words and concepts like government is useful so that they can understand at the same time how alien this is to their own upbringing, and how difficult it is simply to dismiss. Usually when we encounter something we've never heard before, we want to come up with reasons why we can continue to ignore it. I have to say, I have found this attitude most strongly among philosophers. Of all the types of people I've met in the world, the ones who are most inclined to discount something they've never heard before, but philosophy. Whatever, we all do it. We all do that. It's a defense mechanism. I've never heard this before. Oh my God, do I need to rethink all my priorities? No, let's invent it. We don't have to. It's not so easy to dismiss this. Now you have to be honest about the hazards, and this question got to the issue of the hazards of trying to implement a political system on the basis of government and moral. But that doesn't mean the idea is useless. And I think they grasp, I'm in my 30th year of teaching at Penn, so I've seen the results. They grasp the context quite readily. And it's part of what interests them. So they get pulled in. Suddenly they're interested in material that they never imagined they would be interested in, because it offers such a different way of thinking about problems that if they are thinking human beings, they take seriously. And it's a way of approaching these problems that they might not ultimately accept. But if they reach that decision, it's only after considering it carefully and asking themselves, what are the advantages of this way? What are the disadvantages? It's not a sudden, knee-jerk, rash judgment. And often they want to learn more. What else could there be in Chinese philosophy that I haven't heard about? In one day, I learned so much. What else might there be if I give it a little bit of time?
Thank you, Professor Goldin, for the lecture. I'm a student from mainland China, and in high school, we learned through the entirety of the Analects. So I think it was very interesting to see your take on how this would be presented to an American audience. When we were learning, I would like to ask some things about maybe the specifics of teaching, because when we were learning about the Analects, a lot of times we were told that some of these passages have multiple interpretations, even in Chinese. So would this pose a challenge when teaching in English? Would you cover different interpretations of one passage? And also, I would be really interested in how American students usually respond to this, the content problem.
I mean, you're absolutely right that there have been many different interpretations of the Analects over the centuries. and along with that, many different interpretations of particular passages in the Analects over the centuries. And there's two reasons for that. One, so I touched on both of them. Confucius is dead, so we can't ask him what he meant. And the text is also written in such a way as to give us frustratingly little guidance. So often when you don't understand what a statement means, you want to ask the context. Because the same statement can mean different things in different contexts. So often you really want to know what's the context. What were you talking about? So whoever edited the Analects didn't want to do this. It's an interesting decision. So of course there are lots of different. And I deal with that in both the theoretical and a specific manner. Specifically, when there's more than one way to read the passage, I will often tell them, commentators do it this way, some commentators do it that way, because they can't do it. You have to put the commentary in the chapters. I can't tell them what every commentator says about every passage. First of all, because not every commentarial opinion is worth taking seriously. But second of all, because there are more and less influential commentary interpretations. For American students, we have to focus on the ones that have had the most cultural impact. But then in a more general sense, this is what I was trying to do even today, to lay out how little we know about what this would have meant and what kind of interpretive strategies, I'm conscious about this, what kind of interpretive strategies we're using to try to interpret these passages for ourselves. Why is Qi about us? Why is he asking about government? Shouldn't he know about government? But then Jing and Qi, why is he asking about government? The last time we saw Qi ask about governments because he didn't know what he was talking about. Is it the same thing with Jing and Qi? No, it turns out not. As you're sort of building a method on the fly, which is how any reader of Wu has to proceed, because it's not handed to you with a method. I'm quite explicit about that with students. I'm open to a variety of interpretations, but you need to explain the foundation of your interpretation, and other people are not obliged to accept it. But they do need to listen to it. Everyone's opinion in class has to have a hearing.
Hi, Professor. Thanks a lot for the speech. I'm just a little bit curious about the potential danger of Orientalism as an ideology, because for, I guess, at least the lay person, Western audience, they sometimes exhibit this inclination to understand the culture from the Eastern world as being a holistic or somewhat uniform, and Orientalism is the ideology of representing the complexity of Eastern culture into this flattened and somewhat unified doctrine and values. So I'm a little bit curious, because though I'm not an expert about Confucianism, but I feel like when I read those texts, sometimes while they address people at different levels and from different social classes, it could be the case that these texts somewhat leave out the diversity of different cultures and the localities. So I'm just wondering, when you teach the text and give the broader context to your students, have you employed any techniques in your teaching that try to avoid the dangerous ideology of Orientalism?
Yes, as soon as you're sure they understand these ideas, you expose them to the opinions of people who disagree, so that they're well aware that at the same time that people were articulating ideas like this, there were other people who thought this is dangerous, this is foolish, this is whatever. I'm 100% on board. I would be more than 100% on board if that were mathematically possible, with the idea of presenting the diversity of traditional Chinese culture. One of my pet peeves is the flattening and simplification of Chinese culture that one reads in a lot of synthetic accounts. I will say, though, one concern I have about the phrase Orientalism, the word Orientalism, is that it implies that only Western people can do it. I find a lot of simplification and flattening of misrepresentation, simplified misrepresentations of Chinese culture among people who are not Western. So I don't know that I would say Orientalism. That sounds like that sounds a little belligerent. I would call it reification. I would call it simplification. And any responsible educator is obliged to prevent students from taking that.
Would you consider Confucianism a kind of religion in addition to its apply?
My answer to that question is always that religion is not a change. Philosophy is not a change. These words were invented in the 19th century when Chinese intellectuals needed a word to, Chinese and Japanese needed words to translate keywords that they discovered in European literature. So they invented judgment, invented Zhongjia. For most of Chinese history, people got along very well without a concept of philosophy. They got along very well without a concept of religion. So that's an initial warning to me that we're making a category mistake. To me, it's a little bit like asking, is Jesus Christ a genius? It's using an alien way of dividing up the world and asking how a Chinese tradition fits within it. Also, philosophers have a useful concept called pseudo-problem. A pseudo-problem is a problem whose solution depends entirely on one's definition. And the question of whether Confucianism is or is not a religion depends entirely on the definition. You can define religion in such a way that Confucianism is a religion. You can define religion in such a way that it's not. So that's another indication that, to me, that the question excites a lot of people without productive results. If somebody wants to call Confucianism a religion, I won't object, because then obviously that person is using a definition of company. Somebody insists that Confucianism is not a religion, I would also not engage, because it's clear that that person that doesn't apply. I will say that religion is a more useful concept when we're talking about European culture. One example, if you go through the catalog of Bach's compositions, there's basically two kinds. There's his religious works and his secular works. We kind of know which is which. It's a characterization that makes sense in concept in context of a composer who's working in 18th century Germany and writing some things for the church and some things for other patrons who are not associated with the church. In China, it's hard for me to think of a similar distinction. Is such and such a composition religious, such and such a composition secular? It makes a lot less sense when you take the word out of its context. One happy consequence of the open-mindedness about religion is that Confucianism can be taught in a religious studies department. Okay, I'm all for that. But that says more, I think, about the open-minded attitude toward religion in most American religious studies departments, and less about Confucianism. Because alongside Confucianism, they're teaching all kinds of other Hinduism, Islam. And in most American religious studies departments, there's a kind of a pluralistic attitude about this, because they're not theology. They're not teaching Christianity. That's not. So that's a kind of a happy practical byproduct of being open-minded about what the word religion means. But you know, to get American students to get into these texts, ask themselves what's at stake, what are people arguing for, why, how does that resemble or fail to resemble what you've learned before, that kind of question. I don't really have to ask them to decide whether they can wrestle with the material and while setting that question.
Regarding your explanation of the relationship between Confucianism and religion, can we similarly define philosophy in either way, including or excluding Confucianism?
Yes, and the American philosophy departments very often define philosophy in such a way that Chinese philosophy doesn't count. And my response is, okay, if that's going to be your closed-minded definition of philosophy, then I don't need to be part of that program. And that suits both sides. They get to ignore what I have to say, and I get to do my own work.
Thanks for promoting an interesting lecture. So my answer is about the benevolence. Well, when you mentioned Munich and he said benevolence, I think that he's defining as a kind of relational virtue, such as don't profit yourself at the cost of the other. And it reminded me that when Plato he mentioned benevolence, he said it is a process of inquiry, like truth-oriented process is about epistemology. And so I'm wondering, do you think that the difference that how people define benevolence is a key reasons for different culture and thinking in China and the West?
Yeah, don't get hung up on the translation because the word is not benevolence, the word is God. And the way to study it properly, once I entice these students to learn Chinese so that they can read it in the original, then we start asking about how we represent these concepts in English and what is gained and lost by choosing a translation such as benevolence. I call it humanity because Confucians themselves loved the fact that Ren as a virtue and Ren as a person is perfect. They made use of that all the time. So Ren is the virtue that all human beings should have. Benevolence was Lao's choice, and it's good enough. I'm not going to criticize Lao because he says benevolence instead of humanity. But if it leads you to worry about how it does or doesn't correspond to a Greek concept that's also translated as benevolence, then you're getting hung up on it. Philosophers often get because they can't read the text.
Thank you, Professor. I want to follow up on the question previously asked about the religion. And because I remember there's a saying that in the analect that when you go into the ritual, you pretend there is a heaven, a God, but you do all the best to participate in the ritual, but without really considering whether the God is a subject. But how will you interpret this? And is this scenario actually adapted in a diversified modern world that I can basically practice the Confucianism while I actually worship any other god, or mixture of different civilization. So basically, I can still fulfill the virtual requirement, but while I have some religious background in diverse.
In the Analects, the skepticism about belief in ghosts and spirits, stuff like that, is based on the observation that despite centuries of trying, we have not been able to get good moral guidance from ghosts. Remember, Confucius is living in the shadow of the Bronze Age. And he's been hired to teach people about how to use bronze vessels. He comes out of a tradition. And we've been trying and trying and trying and trying and trying and trying to get moral guidance from ghosts. And that method hasn't worked. My interpretation is that Confucius is thinking, why don't we try thinking for ourselves instead of trying to guess what ghosts want us to do? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take Confucianism seriously if you worship other gods. But the first question that Confucian would ask you is, why do you worship other gods? What's your basis? And then you can have a discussion. Then you can have a conversation. But if you're going to worship a god, a Confucian is going to ask you why.
Thank you, Professor Goldin. I'm helping my friend to ask this question. I want to learn more about the issue of translation in Confucian or the sort of classical Chinese non-Western texts. I've noticed that for the translation of such classics into English or whatever language, there are two types of these translations. Some are translated by the native Chinese speakers, and some are translated by those foreign sinologists who learn Chinese themselves. Are there any differences observed for these two types of cases in translations, or are there like which one is better, or which one do you prefer, or yeah, thank you.
That gets into translation theory. And I can tell you my viewpoint, which is that a translation should be either by a native speaker of the target language or include a native speaker of the target language. In other words, a translation could be a collaborative project. In this day and age, it might be best if translations were collaborative projects. Single human beings don't always possess all of the knowledge to be able to translate all the complexities of a text on their own. The problem that often arises when a translator is not a native speaker of the target language is that it can be both awkward or even worse, misleading. A certain translation can be phrased in such a way that native speakers are likely to interpret in a way that the translator didn't anticipate if he or she didn't. It's easily rectified. Bring in a native speaker. I would not presume to translate anything into Chinese. If I were involved in a project like that, I would call in Chinese colleagues and make sure that the translation into Chinese doesn't introduce phrases or articulations that would be misleading to native speakers.
So there are common questions between US students concerning the nations. Just wonder what are some examples that there might be, or would you start with the questions and then to present like to compare the answers to that same questions or concerns in your lecture to them, like what is an ideal society? Or how can you-
What is an ideal society is kind of a great question. I don't find too many Americans asking that question, but what I do hear Americans asking, especially now, what's the purpose of government? And you can't read the analytics for more than 5 minutes before crashing into the question, what's the purpose of government? It's not an American answer, but that's okay. Why do all the answers have to be?
Given what really practice university.
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on what you mean by Confucianism, and if you mean the kind of government that Confucius himself seems to be opposing, then I think the answer is no, that would never last in Chinese history. Remember Confucius's sort of infamous statement, what would you give up if you had to give up either sufficient food, sufficient arms, or the trust of the people? First thing, give up sufficient arms. And then what would you give up if you had to give up either sufficient food or the trust of the people? And Confucius's answer is give up sufficient food, right? People starve. But once you've lost the trust of the people, you can't have any society. I don't think that's it would be kind of scary to practice that.
Yeah, I think it's full of. So then the ideal society, or maybe the Confucian ideal society, not really ideal society.
I don't know that Confucian is talking. Ideal makes me think I'm talking to Plato. I don't know that Confucius ever asked what is an ideal society. It's more like, what are the values that we want to try to realize? The ideal society sounds like Plato Republic. It doesn't sound like the same project. Honestly, I'm not sure I understand why so many interpreters try to find the ideal society. In the case of Confucius, I think this has led to profound misunderstandings. Confucius is not talking about this. But a lot of the times they try to read this as though it were a political manifesto in the Greek tradition. What is an ideal society? I'm just reading.
Thank you, Professor Goldin, for the lecture. Can you share your views, some of your views about the philosophy as a way of life? Because that's a lot of people say the Chinese philosophy is different from different peoples. It's actually a philosophy of life, the same as the ancient Greek philosophy. How would you position that in your teaching to American students?
Well, that's a great question. American undergraduates don't understand what you just asked, Brian. So that's a very good question for more advanced students who have some experience with Hellenistic philosophy. And when you say philosophy as a way of life, they understand what you're talking about and how that contrasts with something. For a more advanced type of student, I think is a very important question. I recently published, it's not even so recent, within the last several years, I published a perspectives on Epictetus from a Chinese point of view. How would the traditional Chinese audience have received the philosophy of what I think is probably the greatest Stoic in Epictetus. And the issue of philosophy as a way of life is crucial. And I think this also helps explain why so many attempted comparisons between Chinese and Greek philosophy have gone awry. People have chosen the wrong comparandum. They've assumed that if you're comparing Chinese and Greek philosophy, it has to be Plato and Aristotle. I think if you want to compare Chinese and Greek philosophy, you're going to find more fruitful terrain in an area like Stoicism, precisely because of this philosophy of life. And it's only within the last 10 years, 20 maybe, but really more like 10, that people have taken this seriously and said, okay, we've been looking in the wrong place. And it's not that China and Greece are incommensurable. We've been looking at the wrong corner of this, or Greco-Roman. There are other classical Western philosophies that are a better fit for China. So I don't know that I would get to that in an undergraduate class, or if I did, I wouldn't use the phrase philosophy as a way of life. I would sort of draw out what that means without getting into the theoretical literature. Draw out. Can you be devoted to this philosophy without practice? Very first line of the answer. What does it mean to follow this philosophy? Can you do it without practice? That would be a way to try to get undergraduates to question this philosophy. And if they were, graduate students, then I'd be more explicitly theoretical kind of question to ask.
That question. If you summarize briefly what is this? Yeah, you mentioned practice, but besides that, what is a good way to describe
Yeah, that's a great question, and that if you get students thinking about that, then you have them right in the middle of Confucius land. But I think thinking and then acting is a good way to think about it. You can't act without thinking, and you can't think without acting. Think, but then it's not complete until you put your ideas into practice. Numerous passages at this question. So it's not a contemplative philosophy in the sense that it doesn't accept contemplation as sufficient in itself. Contemplation is great, but then when the time comes, you need to act. If you're not acting, what's the point? In the passages that we looked at, you are supposed to try to have an impact on the world around you. And you can't do that if you're doing nothing but help. You are interacting with other people. So I had to, I wouldn't want, I had to reduce confusion in slogan. And if you think first, I'm gonna act. But don't cut corners on either side.
The next point, I also provide the point. When I was studying at Prof, my teacher, he was teaching Religion 101. So in that class, he taught Confucianism as one of the religions, not really along with other philosophies, but with other religions. He interestingly, I think to me, it's very interesting. He taught his students that, okay, so you compare these different founders of religion. So like Christianity, maybe Jesus was maybe the criminal.
The founder of Christianity was Paul, but okay.
Okay,
I am named after them.
And Buddha was basically the kind of strange people who give up something and become banker, basically. And Muhammad, politician, yeah, very successful. And then you see maybe Lao Tzu was the librarian. But then Confucius was his scholar. He's learning all the time. So basically, he summarized the Confucian way of life as learning. So
But that's inadequate. It's learning and then acting when the time comes. The next time you see your former teacher, bring up the very first line of the procedure.
Yeah, learning.
If you don't have the procedure, it's not out. So it's not just learning. That I think Confucius would be a little bit cross, as the British say.
After discussing all these big questions, can I follow by asking, what do you believe, or in what way Confucianism is still useful to us today?
Yeah, it's a great question. It helps us think. It helps us think in many respects. It helps us think about how truly universal, and when I say us, Western, how truly universal the allegedly universal ideas that were taught in school really are. But also helps us think about relationships. What kind of considerations go into successful relationships, and what kind of inconsiderate actions threaten relationships. Li Chen Yang and other people have compared Confucianism to ethics of care, and that has merit. That has, and as such, it's an interesting kind of ethics of care, but it's not a feminist one. So there are lots of ways that you could, as I said, I don't present myself to students as salesmen. I don't try to tell them why it's really good for them. I'd rather just show them the car and then let them decide that they want to buy it. But you could think lots of ways to convince someone that Confucianism is worth studying and taking seriously, without committing yourself to being some kind of Confucian proselyte. I'm not saying you should replace the Constitution of the United States with the Green Chapter of Li Qi. There are more practical ways of thinking about it.
Okay, the normal practice.
Well, thank you. These were very stimulating questions. We had a.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you all for coming and joining the discussion.
New Asia Lectures on Confucianism 2025 have successfully concluded. We would like to express our sincere thanks to Professor Goldin and Professor Yao, as well as to all of you for your participation. Once again, we kindly remind everyone to scan the QR code on the back of the lecture booklet to fill out the online feedback form and share your opinions on the lecture. We deeply appreciate your support and hope to see you again at next year's New Asia Lectures on Confucianism. Thank you.